Hello, I'm Junho Jung from the Medical History in Modern Korea. Briefly, we looked at the development of Korean medicine in the 20th century. Let's put that into the perspective with a case study. I would like to take an example from Parasite Eradication Program, which was operated from 1960s to 1995. And this will illustrate the development of Korean medicine in the broader context of international society and geopolitics.
Parasite Eradication Program.
So far, we've looked at the changes in Korean medicine in the 20th century. But how exactly did these changes appear, get used and disappeared? In order to get the answer from this question, let's take a look at the particular case, parasites. In the second half of the 20th century, parasites on the Korean peninsula experienced a massive ecological shift. From an estimated 90% or more infection rate during the Japanese occupation and Korean War, it dropped dramatically to 8.4% in 1983 and then to 0.8% in 1989. This change was due to the impact of rapid social change and active human intervention to control parasitic infections. The nationwide parasite control program, beginning after the liberation, was intensively implemented from 1969 to 1995, led by the Korean Association for Parasite Eradication, which is also known as KAPE. During this period, the nationwide screening and treatment program mobilized more than 300 million people cumulatively and more than 10 million people annually. And the program is now cited as one of the major success stories in Korea's modern medical history. Today, soil-transmitted helminths such as roundworms, whipworms, and hookworms, which were the subject of intensive control in Korea, are believed to have all but disappeared. Anyone who attended school in Korea from the 1970s to the first half of 1990s might have at least one story about leaky stool bags, taking of deworming pills in front of classmates, or even some gruesome story of finding live worms in the toilet after taking the pill. It is not common that so many people have the same experience with a specific health initiative. How did such a huge change come about? The first thing we are going to look into is people's emotions, specifically the emotion of shame.
Roundworm, essential part of our body.
For people in the past, parasites were not something to be ashamed of. They were common and even appeared in the royal records of the Joseon Dynasty king, Yeongjo. One day, Yeongjo was asked to have vomited up a roundworm. But he answered, "The roundworm is a human being's companion, nothing to be despised." The body of a king in the Joseon Dynasty was the utmost noble representation of the nation. But even in that body, worms were present. The ubiquity of parasite was also evident in rural areas of Korea in the 20th century. In the late 1940s, a rural community was experiencing a large number of stomach cramps. The parasitologist treating them was approached by an elderly man who asked him not to get rid of all his roundworms, because there were real and fake roundworms. and he wanted a medicine that would only get rid of the fake ones. The parasitologist got puzzled, since fake roundworms didn't exist in his medical training. Roundworms were just roundworms. The elder explained, again, that the real roundworm was in the center of the body, controlling all the functions of thinking, speaking, and acting. And this time, the real roundworm got angry. If one took medicine to drive out the real roundworm, he would not live as a whole. So the only thing that could be done was to pacify the angry roundworm. In the traditional perception, it was the roundworm that was in the middle of the body of human being. Until the 1960s, when agriculture was the dominant industry, observing worms were a common daily phenomenon for Koreans. A post-liberation survey of intestinal parasite infection rates conducted by the US military found that 82.4% of Koreans were infected with roundworms, 81.1% with whipworms, and 46.5% with hookworms, indicating that most of the population was infected with at least one type of parasite. Parasitologists even self-described Korea as parasite kingdom. Therefore, under such circumstances, parasites were not something people were ashamed of. Rather, parasitic infections were considered natural, a vital part of the body, and even something to be actively protected. But this perception had changed dramatically in just a few decades, and worms became something to be ashamed of. Then, what made the perception of parasite changed?
The girl and the parasite.
The war had a huge impact on changing the perception of parasites. It wasn't until the Korean War that we really saw the harmful effect of roundworms in the stomach. After World War II, the development of weapons of mass destruction led to a surge in the number of troops suffering abdominal trauma. With every penetrating wound, worms were there. A Canadian nurse who worked in a mobile surgical hospital recalled that within 10 minutes of starting an operation, she would see 7 or 8 roundworms. As they crawled out, she would pick them up, throw them into the bucket, and continue to operate. So by the end of the day, the bucket would be full of roundworms. Throughout the Korean War, roundworms living in the small intestine began to crawl out of the body and into the public eye. Then, in 1963, an event occurred that made roundworm infection ever more visible to the public attention. At 10:30 p.m. on October 24th in 1963, a 9-year-old abandoned child appeared at the door of a mission hospital in Jeonju called Jesus Hospital and complained of severe abdominal pain. So, the child was rushed to the emergency room. The abdominal pain had been present for a day before she came to the hospital. And by the time it started, she had already vomited roundworms out of the mouth, raising suspicion of severe infection. At 1:30 a.m. on October 25th, an emergency abdominal surgery was performed under the supervision of Paul Crane, who was a missionary doctor and director of the hospital. As expected, most of the child's small intestine was packed with roundworms. And part of the small intestine was even necrotic due to worm obstruction. The surgeon removed most of the worms from the child's intestine through an incision, and the removed worms from the child's stomach filled a bucket. After the surgery, the total number of roundworms in the child's intestine was numbered 1,063, weighing 4 kilograms. Although the surgery was successful, the child, who had already suffered from malnutrition and intestinal obstruction for a long period, could not recover, and sadly, she died 9 hours after the surgery. The surgeon of the operation, Paul Crane, was perhaps the most traumatized by the incident. So he began to actively promote the work of parasite eradication in Korea through publications, newspaper columns, and social activities. Around the same time, the Korean Association of Voluntary Agencies, KAVA, a coalition of foreign voluntary organizations working in Korea, decided to make parasite eradication one of its main projects. At the time, KAVA was so active and well budgeted that it was often referred to as the country's second Ministry of Health. It accounted for 30% of the Korean government's health and social sector budget. Foreign aid organizations identified and addressed issues that the Korean government were unable to address due to lack of budget and administrative capacity. In social work, this included orphans and reliefs for the disabled, while in healthcare, parasitic infections were high on the agenda, along with tuberculosis. In 1965, the Zero Roundworm movement was launched with the support of newspapers and others. However, despite the aid organization's interest in parasites, the movement did not spread to the general public yet.